Thank you for having me. I'm so sorry that I've had to miss the evening prior and earlier in the day. It's like literally the one weekend where I didn't have more support. So I'm sorry for not being able to be here. So like I said, there's stuff about sexual violence in here. I think you knew that was coming, but also know that I get that it's late in the day. So feel free to come and go as you please. I don't get offended if you need to just get up and take a walk. I've also got a couple links there for self-care, a salty language advisory. There's a couple good words in there, a couple salty pieces, so that will come out throughout. Yeah, and I just wanted to thank Lisa for inviting me. I've seen a lot of her work, and it's a real honor to be part of anything that she's affiliated with. So hopefully my remote yes will work. So in the spirit of gratitude, reconciliation, and truth, I want to acknowledge the land that we are on, the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, consisting of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations, and Region 3 of the Métis Nation of Alberta. I'm really loving that this is part of everyday practice. I get to see this in my son's school and have his own principal talking about these things, and I feel really envious that he's getting an education that I was not partial to when I was growing up, so I'm grateful for that. In terms of a little bit about me, why do I have any credibility at all standing here? I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm a mama. My little guy's back there, so at some point he will laugh hysterically over something at Netflix or have a comment to that, so I apologize in advance. I consider myself a lifelong learner. A lot of this stuff is material that I've been exposed to growing up, and then having the privilege of education. So I've studied, and I study crime, media, and sexual violence. Educator, researcher, and media collector. So I've got lots of videos in here as well, lots of pieces like that. And my agenda, just to give you a roadmap of where we're going. I draw on work that positions gender as a binary. I'm recognizing that gender and sexual orientation is certainly a spectrum, but I want to acknowledge that this work will draw on it and position things as a binary. So I'm going to be speaking about men and women, generally speaking, but I hope that's clear that that's not the way in which I see things, and I think there's lots of room for nuance in between. So we'll begin with looking at some messages about what it means to quote unquote be a man. Talk about rape and rapist stereotypes and the implications for men. We'll make sense of rape culture. Talk a little bit about the impacts and implications of that. What sexual violence is, how it's kind of generally speaking understood. Why does rape culture persist? And then we'll talk about this idea of sexual violence prevention as men's work. So I have a lot of media, I have a lot of data, so at any point feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I'm going to keep plowing through, and then there should be lots of time for conversation. Do not hesitate to put your hand up in the middle, though I think everybody likes a bit of a conversant break. So what does it mean to be a man, in quotes? This is something that I think we're constantly unpacking and evolving. So I've got some clips here from a Huffington Post ad that was out, and then some pieces from, I don't know if anyone's seen The Mask You Live In on Netflix. Right, so there's some pieces from there, and then something from the Bro Code. So I'll show you that, and then we'll unpack that a little bit further. And let me know if you can't hear.
Wow, you're so strong. You got hit by a girl? You throw like a girl.
What are you, gay? Don't be such a pussy. You don't watch football? You're such a mama's boy.
You're so scrawny, you can't even grow a beard. Are you more of an ass man or a boob man?
Dude, you're still a virgin?
Nice guys. Finish class.
Hit it and quit it. Boys will be boys. It's a pretty colorful cocktail you've got there.
You're so sensitive for a guy.
Dude, are you on your period? Between you and your boyfriend, who's the man?
Sorry, I'm a big short guy.
Well, you slept with her?
Don't sleep with a virgin. They get clingy.
You can't make a hoe a housewife.
You're gonna let that guy talk to your girlfriend?
Now you gotta fight.
Don't be a little bitch. Stop being such a fat.
Man up.
You're gonna see Adele in concert? You cry during movies? You're gonna let her talk to you like that?
She has you whipped.
You're the nurse? I thought you were the doctor.
Have you ever done a day of real work in your life?
Your wife's not taking your last name?
Do you mind that she makes more money than you? Isn't that a masculinity?
So, you're just a stay-at-home dad.
You're gonna let your son take dance class?
Almonds. The program that way.
Nice car. Overcompensating for something?
You better keep that daughter of yours locked up.
You do the cooking.
I see who wears the pants and format.
Can you even get it up? He was from a time when men were men.
If you walk onto any playground in America where there's a bunch of boys happily playing, you can start a fight by asking one question. Who's a sissy around here? And two boys will go at it. He is, and they can have a fight, or all of the boys go, he is. And that boy will either have to fight them or run home crying. That idea of being seen as weak, as a sissy in the eyes of other guys, starts in our earliest moments of boyhood. And it follows us all the way through our lives. Saying to other guys that we're not girls, that we're not women, that we're not gay. We've constructed an idea of masculinity in the United States that doesn't give young boys a way to feel secure in their masculinity, so we make them go prove it all the time.
If I can man up or sit down from that, you feel me?
Masculinity is not organic. It's reactive. It's not something that just develops. It's a rejection of everything that is feminine.
Sometimes my friends act like they're tough when I feel like they're not.
From the beginning, we're taught as boys to lock down our emotions. We can't talk about being afraid. We can't talk about being hurt. We could talk about being pissed off. We could talk about being angry. We can't talk about being sad.
If you never cry, then you have all these feelings stuck up inside of you, and you can't get them out.
We put them on that trajectory through our popular culture, through our parenting styles, through our educational styles, and through assumptions about natural manhood and maleness that we pass along that are incredibly insulting and damaging. And then there's a whole social system that polices them through this low level of threat from other men if they're not man enough.
Like yours.
Sure. Do you care how it tastes?
Nah, I don't care.
Okay, well, you start caring, pretend you're personal, and give you another life.
What all masculinity cops share is the desire and ability to remind boys and men about the rules of manhood, to give out verbal and behavioral citations when guys break the rules. And so, for instance, a male athlete caught crying might be confronted and judged for acting like a girl. A guy who doesn't like binge drinking at a party when everyone else is may be labeled a wuss. A guy who doesn't like football and who would rather read or do anything remotely academic may be called a fag. The boy who doesn't feel like doing something dangerous may be called a pussy. These are just a few of the rules of manhood, which tell us to hold in our emotions as expressiveness of branded female, something worthy of insult.
You do! Maybe we should chug on over to Mamby-Pamby land where maybe we can find some self-confidence for you, you jack.
So does this resonate a little bit with what we see, how we see masculinity sort of constructed in mainstream at least? So some of the things that the literature talks about is that ways in which men can set themselves apart is set themselves apart from women. And I want to argue that a tie to sexual violence is that, you know, we see that there's all these mixed messages about being men, but ways that men can differentiate themselves or other is that they're not rapists, right? Men can see themselves as not rapists because rapists have a particular stereotypic sort of positioning in the world. And in the literature, they refer to this as the jump from the bushes, stranger attacker. So we have an attacker who's typically hooded, he's masked, he's carrying a weapon. So rapists are spottable. We can see them coming. We know that they're these bad guys. And we know who to avoid. So women know who to avoid and men know who the bad guys are. So the implications for men when we look at stereotypic representations of rape is that men who don't carry weapons when they're masked or hooded while hiding in the dark to attack women are A-okay. And so we can see that men will say, well, this is not what a rapist looks like. And then Roxane Gay put out this amazing compilation of texts of people who wrote in that, you know, everything that didn't look like that was therefore not that bad. So when we have these stereotypic understandings of sexual violence as something that is done by these sort of stereotypical attackers, we can understand what it is. It's pretty easy to avoid. And life is a little bit safer. But when we look at actual statistics about sexual assault, we see that those statistics in Canada and really throughout North America and the Western world don't hold, that actually 87% of sexual violence is perpetrated by men that women know. So these are not the stranger jump from the bushes attackers, and that in fact, most sexual violence does not result in physical injury and does not involve weapons, which is contrary again to these stereotypical notions. So why do we have this difference between stereotype and reality? What holds here? So we see that stereotypes really position sexual violence as an aberration, something that men do, that these sort of sadists, these spottable sexual violence predators, we can see them coming. It's an aberration that they do. When a lot of the the scholars that work in sexual violence will actually say that rape culture and sexual violence is a cultural norm. It's actually an expression of the norm as opposed to something deviant. So what is rape culture? We hear this concept a lot, and people often think, if you hear something like rape supportive culture, it must mean that you support the idea of sexual violence, which we know isn't the case. So if we look at a definition of rape culture that we can sort of unpack and use throughout the rest of this, looking through Transforming a Rape Culture, a really great edited series. So they define rape culture as a complex of beliefs that encourages male sexual aggression and supports violence against women. In a rape culture, both men and women assume that sexual violence is a fact of life, as inevitable as death or taxes. This violence, however, is neither biologically nor divinely ordained. Much of what we accept as inevitable is in fact the expression of values and attitudes that, on the optimistic side, can change. So if we're going to look at sort of the key points here, rape culture encourages male sexual aggression, supports violence against women, and is assumed to be a fact of life. So if we're going to use this little sticky note and take this through the remainder of the things that we're going to look at, those are sort of the 3 points about rape culture that we'll take up. Troublingly, I want to say it starts early. Before I became a mother, I was, committed to vetting everything that my son ever looked at. He was never going to take up a piece of media or anything that I hadn't previewed. And then I became a mom and realized that that's impossible. So mostly I'm like, if it looks like it's age appropriate and I can hear it and I can see what's going on, he can watch it. And he sat down to watch Alvin and the Chipmunks one day. So this is season 1, episode 1. It's the new revised version. I thought, surely we've come some way. I'm going to show you a 1-minute clip about Alvin and the Chipmunks and show you how rape culture starts young.
I'm so sorry.
Turn it up.
I'm sorry, but I really have to see how it's doing. Until we meet again.
So people will often say to me, well, you see it because you look for it. And what I want to say is once you're aware of it, you can't unsee it. This is a 1-minute clip. Alvin engages in 7 gestures that are met by his teacher with shock, distaste, or blatant refusal. And he continues nonetheless. He's not checking in. He's not attentive to whether she's even sort of down with this. And the only person who kind of calls him out is another woman. So I'm like, wow, okay, so we're not going to watch Alvin and the Chipmunks, sweetie. So again, rape culture encourages male sexual aggression. This idea starts little, that it's okay to pursue relentlessly and to not pay attention to how that is being taken up. I wish it was isolated just to Alvin and the Chipmunks, but we can look at Disney, why these Disney films may help perpetrate rape culture. And I have to say, I'm featuring my 2 favorite Disney films growing up, but that's just because these are the ones that are featured here. But sadly, this is what I grew up loving. So this idea of Beauty and the Beast is a good guy who's verbally abusive and actually imprisons Belle. Some men have a hard time accepting the verbal and nonverbal cues of women, so one could get the message that women must always be on the defense when it comes to rejecting men because some guys respond with violence. Sleeping Beauty, so we know this story, Sleeping Beauty, the prince comes in and he kisses the unconscious woman or assaults her. Given that she's basically in a coma, she can't consent to being kissed. This pressure compels Prince Philip to enter Aurora's bedroom and kiss her even though she's unconscious. So this is problematic because it ultimately rewards really questionable behavior. I have people talk about how they've seen these themes in Twilight and other films. A clip from an excerpt from Not That Bad, that compilation that I spoke about earlier. This woman speaks about taking her daughter to the Lego movie, and she says, my daughter's getting fed a lot of phony girl power that through books and television and clubs at school, and then they go to the schoolyard where they get their real messages. They catch ads in the subway, they overhear conversations at the diner. I take them to the Lego movie, much admired, roundly praised, critical darling, and they watch as the main female character is objectified throughout the entire thing. She says, we need a break from all this empowerment. So, interesting, again, that it's, shows up even in Lego films. So rape culture encourages male sexual aggression, supports violence against women, and we see it in places like Disney and the Lego film. And it just continues. So these are magazines from the UK. These are popular magazines that are referred to here in this study. So these scholars wanted to look at whether what they call lads magazines or men's magazines, are they mainstreaming dangerous sexism? And they compared quotes from convicted rapists and things that showed up in these magazines. And so they had highlighted various things. They talked about how these studies show an overlap in the content of convicted rapist talk and the things that show up in these magazines. And the framing of this normalizes it for young men. So they talked about various things that are stated. Some women are domineering, but I think more or less it's the man who should put his foot down. A man is supposed to be the man. If he acts like it, she won't be domineering. If a law is passed, there should be a dress code when girls dress in those short skirts and things like that. They're just asking for it. A girl may like anal sex because it makes her feel incredibly naughty and she likes feeling like a dirty slut. If that's the case, you can try all sorts of humiliating acts to help out her filthy fantasy. And these are things from the magazine. So I'll let the researchers speak for themselves about what they found here.
We gave quotes that were drawn from the interviews with convicted rapists and quotes drawn from these lads' magazines. And few men and women saw us which were which. They couldn't do anything much better than performing a chance. So that showed that the two were really overlapping with each other. Realistically, we gave young men.
Can you hear it? Can't hear it?
We didn't stop.
It's cranked.
Always missed the source, saying
it's as loud as it gets. It's as loud as it gets. And that's no. It's as loud as it gets.
What we found in that study was that young men were quicker to identify with quotes that they thought were drawn from last night. So jointly, these studies tell us two things. It says that there is an overlap in content, the legitimation that rapists use to legitimate their violence against women, and the sense of things that are said about women in last. At the same time, they show us that when those things are intrusive to that time, that they're easier for women to identify with. The participants that we marked were sometimes quite surprised when they found out where these quotes were drawn from. So in the study where they were asked to categories, they drew up theories that they would see only normal kind of sexism and not extreme kind of sexism.
Can you all hear it back there? Or is it just no? Okay. Barely? You can? I think he's nearly done here. So basically what he was talking about was that these young men are reading these magazines and they're quick to identify with things that they think come out of the magazines, and then they're later told that this is things that convicted rapists say. But it's difficult to extrapolate from these magazines which is which because the overlap is so similar. Hopefully the rest of the videos will play better. So again, we have male sexual aggression, supports violence against women, and then it continues. So Gavin de Becker wrote a book called The Gift of Fear. And in it, he talks about something that he calls the Hollywood formula. And he says the Hollywood formula could essentially be understood as this. Boy wants girl, girl doesn't want boy, boy harasses girl. And he uses Cheers, are most of us old enough to remember Cheers a bit, as his kind of case study. And so for those of you unfamiliar with Cheers, it's about a retired, I think he's a baseball player, and he has a bar, and he works with these women who are his bosses. So he says, DeBecker says, Sam's persistent and inappropriate sexual harassment of 2 female coworkers, 8 years of it doesn't get him fired or sued. What it does get him is both women. And so it's easy to then say, well, this, Gavin DeBecker's referring to a show that was many, many years old. So this is probably a dated and obsolete concept, but we don't actually have to look that far to find current modern day examples. And so he says, entertainment media teaches men that if you just stay with it, even if you offend her, even if she says she wants nothing to do with you, even if you've treated her like trash, and sometimes because you've treated her like trash, you'll get the girl. So if we distill that, it's stay with it, offend her, she wants nothing to do with you, treat her like trash, and because you've treated her like trash, you'll get the girl. So again, these are sort of the messages that we are being inundated, both men and women, about sexual pursuit. So again, male sexual aggression and supporting violence against women, and hopefully these clips will be louder. If not, I apologize in advance. So it continues. We see advertising today that takes up all kinds of violence against women in these very permissible sort of ad-based ways. I'm going to skip it if the sound is not good, but hopefully it is. So Googling the objectification of women.
I love giving blowjobs to sandwiches. I love sacrificing my dignity for a drink. I love listening to guys that don't know my name. The pursuit of happiness, just as our forefathers wanted. I hope when my daughter grows up that she has friends just like these. The key to my heart? A man that smells like a vagina. I'd sell my body for a burger. Nothing makes me madder than watching a guy get his head blown off. I'm only here for your entertainment. What goes great with this dish? My butt. Obviously, my douche can sell anything. When I reach into my designer handbag, you know I'm naked. This shirt looks too good for pants. Peekaboo. Like what you see?
Then we have a clip here from Killing Us Softly.
In a culture in which women's bodies are constantly turned into things, into objects. Here she's become the bottle of Michelob. In this ad, she becomes part of a video game. And this is everywhere, in all kinds of advertising. Women's bodies turned into things, into objects. Now, of course, this affects female self-esteem. It also does something even more insidious. It creates a climate in which there's widespread violence against women. I'm not at all saying an ad like this directly causes violence. It's not that simple. But turning a human being into a thing is almost always the first step toward justifying violence against that person. We see this with racism, we see it with homophobia, we see it with terrorism. It's always the same process. The person is dehumanized and violence then becomes inevitable. And that step is already and constantly taken with women. Women's bodies are dismembered in ads, hacked apart. Just one part of the body is focused upon, which of course is the most dehumanizing thing you could do to someone. Everywhere we look, women's bodies turned into things and often just parts of things.
So all of these ads, right, go to show the ways in which we sort of every day see women's bodies treated in particular ways that, again, support this idea of sexualized violence. So when you look at studies, so this one is about understanding the relationships among white and African American women's sexual objectification experiences, physical safety, anxiety, and psychological distress. No surprise, taken together, the results suggest that a context that objectifies women and their bodies is related to their sense of safety and security in the world. So if this is how we're seeing ourselves represented, and then these are further ads that just depict violence against women. There's a man with a tie who's dragging what looks like an unconscious woman across a car. Foot in the butt, there's a woman's bodies in the back of a truck or a vehicle. A number of men holding a woman down, a passed out woman. So interestingly, the argument usually goes that sex and violence sell. And so, you know, we didn't make the system, but that's how it works. But yet studies show that there has been little value for marketing success when you're actually using these tactics. So that notion that sex and violence sell is perhaps mythical. So again, we see that this work is encouraging male sexual aggression and supporting violence against women. And I have another ad for you. This is a little bit lighter, but this one gets at the idea that sexual violence is inevitable and it plays on women's fears. So here we have an ad that's being mocked through a show called Target Women. Can you hear it?
Are never safe. Not even when you're playing soccer with your daughter at home in broad daylight.
This is Mark with Royce Security.
Someone just tried to break in.
Sitting in a break-in.
Thank you. Thank goodness she had a Broadview security alarm system. And thank goodness that guy was like not super subtle about breaking into her house. In the peaceful era we live in, it's easy to forget that someone is always lurking outside, planning to rape you. The Broadview security, formerly Briggs, can help you remember that if you're a woman alone, when you're a victim waiting to happen, women are never safe. Not when they're doing computer stuff, not running on treadmills, and not even when they're shooting a target.
So these ads again show, right, that sexual violence is inevitable, and so women must do what they can to position themselves as safe in the world by getting these kinds of security systems. So those were all legitimate commercials that she's actually making fun of in here. But the Broadview Security actually it markets and it thrives on fear. So how does rape culture impact men and women in our conduct? Generally speaking, again, treating gender as binary here, but how does it impact our interactions? Again, I have a clip here, but this expectation of sexualized homosociality. So I don't know if folks are familiar with the concept of homosociality, but I learned about it, and the way that I sort of describe it is chest pounding that men do for other men, performing for other men. And by way of analogy, my partner and I went on a trip a while ago with, I want to say about 5 or 6 years ago, with friends that we'd had. So his friend, he had grown up with, so they'd known each other for about 20 years. His friend loves to push the envelope, says really inappropriate, really offensive things, and that's kind of his shtick. And so he loves to make comments about women's bodies, about race, about gender, which is troubling for me. And my partner said, well, I've known him for years, so, we tolerate it. Interestingly, we had this moment when we were away, and his friend started to say some things, and my partner chimed in, and they started to do the same thing. And I was like, are you kidding me? I thought, okay. And they went out to get something, and his wife, so again, we've known them for many years. His wife said to me, Kiara, I don't know why my partner acts the way he does, but it's only when he's around your partner. And I was like, are you kidding me? Because my partner only acts like that when he's around your partner. So for 20 years, I actually think these men have been performing for each other in this particular way, and neither of them know each other outside of that context. That's the only way they knew how to perform, was in these kind of really gross, regressive ways. And it floored me when she said that, because I had just assumed that that's who this guy was. And she said, oh no, he's never like this. He only shows up this way for your partner. And they had met in grade 7. So what kind of performances they were doing in grade 7 held on, now it's like close to 30 years. So like that's really fascinating to me. So that's an example of homosociality, but what he talks about here in this next clip is this idea, this way in which homosociality shows up in men's treatment of other women.
When I went to college, there was this pressure to engage in hookup culture. Alcohol was this tool for me to be assertive and aggressive and predatory, to find women to have sex with, so that I could go back and impress other men, particularly around just other guys. I always want to be a person talking about a woman's ass or her breasts. There's an implied sense that women exist for us to have sex with them. They exist for us. I don't think that we think about the implications of that.
I would probably argue that that's the case, right? Again, looking at my partner and his friend, I don't think that they've, for a second, until of course I pointed the story out to them, thought about the implications of that. And then as somebody who studied language, again, going back to Tony Porter, so it was a great segue with Lisa's stuff, he talks here about how this shows up in our language and the things, again, that we take for granted. And it's very interesting doing this work and unpacking the kinds of things that we say all the time or that we hear in culture. So Tony Porter talks about this briefly here.
As a young man, you're taught a man is supposed to always be on the prowl. A man is supposed to always be the aggressor. They say things like, who's that? I like to hit that. I like a piece of that. I like to tear that shit up. So think about it. Hit, violence. Tear, violence. It, object. That, object. We're actually teaching them consciously and subconsciously, on purpose or not to see the humanity in girls.
And so fascinating, right? That's language that is used on an everyday basis by young people to speak about sex, consensual engagement. Hit that, tear that, you know, like. So then we go back to.
Call what we do our little
I'll let her
boys,
speak.
And men, the great setup. We raise boys to become men whose very identity is based on rejecting the feminine, and then we are surprised when they don't see women as being fully human. So we set them up. We set boys up to grow into men who disrespect women at a fundamental level. And then we wonder why we have the culture that we have.
So again, right, it's one thing to unpack it and to point at men and say, geez, you should all be doing better. But we play a role in this. If you remember the clip that from the Borough Code where the female bartender says, you know, when you put your purse down, right? This is something that we're all sort of implicated in, sometimes just by virtue of the language that we're using, but we're setting people up to not do well. And interestingly, there's a researcher named Jeanette Norris, and she talks about this as the cognitive tightrope. So the way this plays out for women is that women have to walk what she calls a cognitive tightrope. And she says it's this idea where women basically wanting to please men, wanting to get men's attention. So we see the way that women's bodies are objectified. So women need to show up in a particular way, particularly young women, to be sexually appealing, to drink with and party with men, but to also not be sexually assaulted by them. So women have to make these choices where they're navigating these decisions about both being appealing to men and not succumbing to the violence that we are taught is sort of surrounding us. And so this leaves women with a lot of contradictions, right? These are no surprise things that women can't live up to when the expectation is that we be really, really safe, but that also we have to live up to these objectified ways in which our bodies are treated. So this is a clip from 1985 that I would argue still holds today. Some of you might recognize it.
You ever done it? I don't even have a psychiatrist. Have you ever done it with a woman? Didn't you already cover this?
You never answered the question.
Look, I'm not going to discuss my private life with strangers.
Hide the devil in a sword.
What?
Well, if you say you haven't, you're hurt. You say you have, you're a slut. It's a trap. You want to, you can, and when you do, you wish you didn't, right?
Wrong.
Or are you teased?
So this places women right in these categories of being prudes or sluts or teases, and you can't necessarily be any or all of them. When it comes to sexualized violence, it's no surprise to women are generally more believed when they report being sexually assaulted if they fall into sort of the what they call the genuine victim or the real victim category, which is very demure, very virginal, very wholesome, and typically white and privileged. But you're not believed if you didn't fight like hell to get out of that. So again, these paradoxes that people are supposed to exist within in terms of sexual violence. So where does this leave us? This leaves us in a place of very divergent frameworks. And I want to argue that when we have these mixed messages for men about what it means to be masculine, what it means to show up, how men are supposed to speak about women and then also somehow be respecting them, and then women are supposed to be presenting themselves in sexually appealing ways while also mitigating safety. This is a humorous clip now to lighten things up a little bit from when Jon Stewart was host of The Daily Show. And it just goes to show the sort of different frameworks in which men and women exist as they try to make sense of sexual violence.
Jordan Klepper and Jessica Williams have come up with some campus safety do's and don'ts. Guys, take it away.
Okay, bros, party commandment number 1. Beer before liquor, never been sicker.
And ladies, never lose sight of your drink ever. Don't be a doofy, watch out for a roofie.
This is a big one, guys. Don't pass out on the couch. Someone might draw like a dick on your face.
Yes, do not pass out on the couch, ladies. Someone will put their dick on your face at a minimum.
I meant it. You know what? Never mind. Now, if you and your bros do get hammered, which you will, nice. Friends, don't let friends drive drunk. Take a cab. You just pass out the back.
Oh, and also, friends don't let friends stay in a party trunk. Girls, get her out of there. Call a cab. It's from an actual cab company that has a website, not just some creepy guy with a yellow car.
Breath mints. Breath mints are
Okay, wait, I'm not done. Don't get in a cab with doors that lock automatically. You want to ride with one hand on the door handle and the other on your friend so you can break or fall if you need to jump and roll.
Chapstick.
Shut up! Shut up! When you're in the cab, follow your route on Google Maps. If the driver makes a weird left turn, drop a pin on the map, call 911, and get ready to jump, girl. You in danger!
Yikes. If it's such a hassle, why don't you just walk home?
Really? Okay, ladies, if you're gonna walk home, make sure you brought an overcoat to hide those scans. You can just throw a blanket over your drunk friend. Ditch the heels and chain to your some shoes that you can run in. It's not the masculine game. You have a hoodie, keep it up, and no earbuds, okay? You might as well wear a sign that says, I can't hear anything. Attack me from behind, please. Make sure you get your keys up before you get to your apartment. And then, to make sure anyone within earshot doesn't find out that you live alone, open the door and shout, honey, I'm home!
Bros before hoes. And don't text your junk. Because nowadays, potential employers will check social media.
Oh my God, that reminds me. Oh my goodness. Ladies, if your crazy ex won't stop texting you, pictures of his junk, save all of them. Also, any angry voicemails, weepy voicemails, threatening tweets and Tumblr posts, and surveillance footage of him standing outside of your window watching you sleep. Just save it all, okay? The college and the cops won't do anything, but maybe it will help you with your civil suit.
Let's be real. You're telling me that women just spend their whole day navigating an obstacle course of sexual mess?
Yeah, pretty much.
Seriously.
Seriously.
Sorry. But not all men are bad, and some are still gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay, yeah, thanks. You know what? I'll keep that in mind the next time a guy says he wants to lick my back while I'm walking to work at 8 in the morning.
Jordan Klepper and Jessica Williams.
Yep. So, I mean, it's a parody, but can we relate women in terms of some of the things that we're taught, right? It's this amalgam of things that constantly go through her head. Jackson Katz has a great exercise that he does in his class, and he draws a line down the middle of the board, and he says, again, he treats gender as binary, and he says, okay, so men, women, tell me what you do on an everyday basis to keep yourself safe from sexual violence. And so women will shout out, what?
Watch around.
Look around,
keys out.
Have your keys out.
Some kind of weapon.
Watch your drink.
Have spray with you.
Have spray with you.
Don't listen to music when you walk.
That's right. And all the things that she talks about. And the board quickly fills up. And then he says, there's nothing on the guy's side. And he says, usually there's a quiet, and then some guy laughs and says, don't go to jail. And that's it. And he said, it's a really powerful exercise where the men in the room haven't needed to appreciate that this is kind of the everyday sexual menace that he talks about, that women sort of negotiate. And it's really interesting because when I did my dissertation, I did it on how we talk about sexual violence. And I talked to men, the really close men in my life that I love and adore, and I told them about this work that I'm so excited about. And I had two separate men on two separate occasions say to me, can we not talk about this anymore? I'm a little raped out. I don't want to think about it anymore. And it was really fascinating to me that they could actually ask that, and that could be something they could do. They could just exempt themselves from thinking about it. And I would argue that for many women, we are raised from a very young age constantly thinking about it on some low level, way. So what does this mean? So then when we look here at, when I say things, and Kleppner says this at the end, right? Anytime I'm talking about sexual violence and men, the disclaimer is always warranted, right? Just like he said, well, it's not all men. Not all men do this. And I think this room in particular is, really plugged into that, but that's not always the case when I go out and do this work. And so what's really important that I always have to make really clear is that when I'm saying that most sexual assaults are perpetrated by men, because we know this to be a fact, that is not the same thing as saying that most men perpetrate sexual assault, which is often what people hear, which is what prompts the not all men narrative. And so I say, let me break this down a little bit further just again, because I want people to stay plugged in. I want people to still be listening to what it is that we're saying, but when there's this knee-jerk reaction. So we can see that most assaults are perpetrated by men. If we look at all perpetrators, almost all of them are men. But when we look at all men, we see that few of them are perpetrators. But this is something that gets lost somehow in the mix, right? So again, to say that most sexual assaults are perpetrated by men is not to say that all men perpetrate sexual violence. And the implications here are clear in the sense that this idea, we don't know which men are the ones who do it. So unfair, not all men. Imagine a bowl of M&Ms, 10% of them are poison. Go ahead, eat a handful. Not all M&Ms are poison. Yes, all women. So this hashtag emerged in response to the not all men argument, because what this woman had said, who then actually for a year later was underground, had pulled herself out of all social media because of the rape and death threats she got. She said, yes, we know that not all men do this, but all women experience this kind of fear because we don't know which one of you it is. And so the implications for women, this is a really fantastic book by F. Vera Gray, The Right Amount of Panic, How Women Trade Freedom for Safety. And what she argues in here is that women, inundated with these messages, have to live up to this idea that we have to be careful, because if we're not careful enough, we had it coming. But if we're too careful or too freaked out, we're paranoid. So women have to have just the right amount of panic to exist in the world and keep themselves safe. So more implications for men and women shows up in terms of our everyday interactions. And this is an argument that I like to use especially for men who will say, I'm not part of I don't need to be part of this. I don't hurt women. I would never dream of hurting women. The problem is you're implicated because we don't know that. And so there's a clip from the movie Wild. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it's Cheryl Strayed. She did the Pacific Crest Trail. And this is a moment, and I remember watching it in the film and going, oh, this is it. And so what I hope it demonstrates is this idea that when we don't know who's doing what to whom out in the world, every engagement that we have initially in these heterosexual encounters possibly feel like this, especially for women. So take a peek at this. So she's hiking alone, for those of you that haven't seen this, and it's kind of the middle of the night, and she's run out of some supplies. And if you can't see, I'm going to narrate a little bit because the screen isn't that clear. She sees kind of a vehicle off in the distance.
What can you buy me?
Please, Cheryl. Mom, he's here. I ran out of food. I just wondered if you could take me someplace I can get a warm meal.
Work.
Yeah, I understand. So maybe when you're finished, you could take me somewhere?
So you can't quite make it out. She is waiting in his truck just as he's suggested, and it's getting darker, obviously.
Wednesday. You can come back to my place for a hot dinner with a shower.
Okay.
So what kind of woman are
What kind?
you? You like a Jane? You know, Tarzan's a Jane. You a Jane? My woman? I got a little something for us. It is a few more cake.
Sure.
Ladies first. It's cheap, but it's good. See? Yeah. I'm gonna call you Jane.
My husband's heading to Cuba. He's just a little bit further down the trail. We're gonna be up really soon. Probably about 20 minutes.
I got a little something else I like to do after the hard days. Like licorice.
Oh, thanks.
Come on, Jane. All right, you gotta promise that you're not gonna tell my wife, because she hates it when I eat candy.
So you can see the trepidation she has sitting there waiting. She doesn't know what kind of man he is. He reaches underneath her. She doesn't know what he's getting. He brings out licorice. Something is behind his licorice. He ends up taking her back to his place. He's got a family. Wife cooks this beautiful meal. It's very safe. But it's in that interaction, right, where she doesn't know who he is. And she's kind of at his mercy. And I want to argue that this is kind of what it feels like for women. You know, when we walk down a street at night and a man is approaching, we don't know who you are. And this was, you know, one of the things that my girlfriend had talked about. She said her friend had said to her, he had said, you know, I was taking the C train home one night, and he said, this woman, he was on the C train and it stopped at the platform, the doors open, and this woman like stepped on and then saw that it was just him and stepped off. And he was like, I would never hurt her. I would never, oh my God. And he was so upset that the fact that he was kind of being understood as somebody that might harm her. And she said, this is why you need to be involved in this stuff, because this is, she couldn't have known that. So what does sexual violence actually look like? Yeah.
I've noticed, like, I don't know if this is something that some of the younger men have learned. Like, I've noticed sometimes when it's dark and I'm walking, I usually cross the street, but I've noticed some men are like crossing the street now, which I totally appreciate. I always want to say thank you, but then I thought, okay, maybe they're just crossing. I don't know, right?
And it's that weird interaction, right? Because men are also wanting to do that, to say, I'm not going to hurt you, but then to say, I'm not going to hurt you can be free. Yeah.
That should be one of the t-shirts. I crossed the street across.
Yeah, it's actually, I have as part of the practical tips, there's actually a campaign that was put out that talks about walk like a woman, and it gives 7 tips for men when they're walking at night for that understanding. So yeah, so in terms of, you know, rape culture or what sexual violence looks like, people will often refer to this pyramid, which can be helpful in terms of understanding that, you know, you have rape jokes, victim blaming, non-consensual pornography, things like this at the bottom, and you can't have explicit violence like rape and murder without the support, these social supports that exist at the bottom, and I'll unpack that a little bit in a second. But what they talk about here are the attitudes and actions at the bottom reinforce and excuse the things up top. And that this is systematic, right? This is not just something that one person does and that informs, you know, their particular activities. And this triangle only gets more complicated when we look at intersectionality, right? We look at considerations. And this one came out, which is a really fascinating, beautiful triangle, Black women's triangulation of rape. And it talks about, you know, a lot of the things that were on the former one are just small pieces here. So there are things like devaluing, dehumanizing, stereotyping, over-sexualizing, cultural appropriation, denying resources, systemic barriers that really only worsen or amplify some of the other problems. So here we go. So the probability of being sexually assaulted, what the literature will tell you, is linked to marginalization, and it's compounded where there are overlapping inequalities. So for example, it's 3 times higher for Indigenous women. There are 3 times higher likelihood of being sexually assaulted by somebody. Vulnerable groups are particularly, and again, if you compound that vulnerability, so immigrant and refugee women, women of color, Two-Spirit women, women in remote communities, women facing other inequalities, and elevated rates, of course, for gender and sexually diverse people, mental, psychological, and physical, those with mental, psychological, and physical disabilities, and those, and I really like that you didn't say poverty, I'm gonna change that slide, and housing insecurity. So why does rape culture persist? This is a question, if everybody understands that rape is not a good thing to do, rape culture is bad. Tony Porter talks about the man box a lot, which is really important, but there's a guy named Chuck Derry who talks about we have to also look at what is in it for people to continue doing things that they don't necessarily appreciate, is bad. So he talks about, we have to talk about, yes, there are things that police people into staying in the man box, but why do men sometimes want to stay in the man box? Why are they comfortable in there? And he said, we have to really unpack what goes with that. And I found this incredible piece. And I feel like if we can all learn from this 14-year-old boy who really unpacks what exists within the box to keep people in it. So he's this 14-year-old boy named Royce Mann. This was 2 years ago. He won this competition. It's a slam poem. Oh.
My poem is titled White Boy Privilege.
I think I
Dear women,
there we go.
I'm sorry. Dear Black people, I'm sorry. Dear Asian Americans, dear Native Americans, dear immigrants who come here seeking a better life, I'm sorry. Dear everyone who is in the middle or upper class white boy, I'm sorry. I have started life at the top of a ladder while you were born on the first rung. I say now that I would change places with you in an instant, but if given the opportunity, would I? Probably not, because to be honest, being privileged is awesome. I'm not saying that you and me on different rungs of the ladder is how I want it to stay. I'm not saying that any part of me is for a moment even liked it that way. I'm just saying that I fucking love being privileged and I'm not ready to give that away. I love it because I can say fucking and not one of you is attributing that to the fact that everyone with my skin color has a dirty mouth. I love it because I don't have to spend an hour every morning putting on makeup to meet other people's standards. I love it because I can worry about what kind of food is on my plate instead of whether or not there will be food on my plate. I love it because when I see a police officer, I see someone who's on my side. To be honest, I'm scared of what it would be like if I wasn't on the top rung, if the tables were turned and I didn't have my white boy privilege safety blanket to protect me. If I lived a life lived by what I lack, not what I have, if I lived a life in which when I failed, the world would say, told you so. If I lived the life that you live. When I was born, I had a success story already written for me. You were given a pen and no paper. I've always felt that that's unfair, but I've never dared to speak up because I've been too scared. Well, now I realize that there's enough blankie to be shared. Everyone should have the privileges that I have. In fact, they should be rights instead. Everyone's story should be written, so all they have to do is get it read. Enough said. No, not enough said. It is embarrassing to still live in a world in which we judge another person's character by the size of their paycheck, the color of their skin, or the type of chromosomes they have. It is embarrassing that we tell our kids that it is not their personality, but instead those same chromosomes that get to dictate what color clothes they wear and how short they must cut their hair. But most of all, it is embarrassing that we deny this, that we claim to live in an equal country, in an equal world. We say that women can vote. Well, guess what? They can run a country, own a company, and throw a nasty curveball as well. We just don't give them the chance to. I know it wasn't us 8th grade white boys who created this system, but we profit from it every day. We don't notice these privileges though because they don't come in the form of things we gain, but rather the lack of injustices that we endure. Because of my gender, I can watch any sport on TV and feel like that could be me one day. Because of my race, I can wish.
So again, I think if we can take a page out of the 14-year-old's book, right? Right? And to be clear, that was from one class that he was offered in junior high. And he says it should be offered everywhere, right? So like, I mean, full body chills when you, right? So 14. And interestingly, again, in terms of backlash and response to these kinds of things, they had to disable the comments on this video on YouTube because he received so many threats. So again, equality, you know, with the quote, privilege is when equality feels like oppression. So, all right, so the argument goes that prevention is men's work. It's men's work to be done when it comes to sexual violence. And why is that? I talk a lot about in sexual violence work, women are taught all the time about safety tips and ways that we're supposed to keep ourselves safe, and that is prevention. The actual definition of prevention is to stop something where it starts. When women are told to do all of these things, these safety tips that were talked about earlier, this is actually avoidance. These are avoidance and deferral strategies that just put them off to somebody else. Somebody else will be assaulted. Because men's work is prevention work, because no matter how well trained women become, in all of the things we're taught, avoidance, escape, and physical self-defense, women will always be vulnerable to sexual assault to the extent that there are men out there who are still willing to commit it. So this is where prevention work really starts with men. So where do we even begin? We begin basically by giving a shit. We have to start off with a little bit of empathy by recognizing that this is where we need to start. And there's all kinds of tools out there. The male privilege checklist, this comes from the white privilege, unpacking the invisible knapsack piece. And we know that privilege, of course, is also intersectional, and so some have more privilege than others. And we have to start, I would argue, little. This is one thing that we always forget, right? And some of the pieces that tend to stick out when I do these presentations are the Disney stuff and the kids stuff, because we forget. We think we're so busy targeting men. Thomas Macaulay Miller wrote this piece, but he's talking about with his little boy, you know, he says things to, he said, this is what it looks like, you know, if she's not having fun, you have to stop when they're playing on a playground. I have to say that being a mother, I want to traffic all the time in exchange with my kid when I want to eat him every day, and I'll say to him, he'll bring me something, and or say, Mom, can I have a snack? And I want to say, give me a kiss first. But he needs to not have those messages, right? That any sort of affection is part of an exchange. So it's really interesting how much my politics came into real life when I became a mother, and all those things that I took for granted and thought, you know, I understood on an intellectual level. And then in practice, it's like, wow, okay, I really have to be paying attention to a lot of these things. This guy, Mike Reynolds, goes by the Twitter handle Everyday Girl Dad, and I had reached out to him and asked him if he minded if I had used this in a presentation earlier. So what he talks about is, he says, have you ever heard somebody say something along the lines of, you can't talk to kids about sex, they're too young. And he's got 2 little girls that he's constantly tweeting about. So he says, okay, by extension, let kids be kids, protect their childhood innocence, because one day they'll learn about the real world. In response to those sentiments, let me tell you a short story. Let us not get the concept of consent tied up exclusively with sexual activity. That's simply wrong. Consent is allowing someone else to make choices for themselves, and you listening and respecting these choices. So he says, to wit, our 5-year-old is fierce as hell. She'd be great to follow around with a camera all day long. She's a star. I'd love to have 1,000 pictures of her on my wall, videos of her to remind me of the stuff she says. We could all benefit from this. Aha, but she hates having her picture taken. This is where consent comes in. We don't take her picture. We know she doesn't like it because she's told us. So we ask her every time we would like a picture, and she says no, almost always. So we would love to beg her to change her mind. Oh, but that's coercion, and that's also wrong. So we don't take her picture. Not if she's singing her favorite song from Moana, not if she's flying around like a superhero, not if she's giving her sister a hug. We would love to beg, what is more important, that I have a picture of her casting a magic spell on my phone, or that she knows that we will listen to her? That was rhetorical. It's her knowing we will listen, that she makes choices for herself. And so we barely ever take pictures of her, only on those occasions she asks us to, or where she says, yeah, sure, I'm so cool. Look at that, consent and coercion discussions with a 5-year-old. Completely appropriate, completely simple. You can have these conversations, people. You need to have these conversations. So again, we don't always think that we think, oh, consent is this big thing. You know, one of the big things we talk about in sexual violence work, right, is like, how do we even begin talking about consent when we don't talk about sex comfortably. But these are ways that we can do it in these reachable, approachable ways. We also have to call out grown-ups, right? So Jackson Katz talks a lot about this, and this he said when I was I saw him speak in Red Deer a while ago. He said we need to raise the bar a little higher for what it means to be a good guy, more than just saying I'm not a rapist, because a lot of men, and particularly men in my life as I've grown up, will say I don't need to be part of this work, I don't rape women. So he says just saying that is not something that guys should be getting high fives for. We need a whole lot more from men. What do we need? In a nutshell, we need more men with the strength, the character, the consciousness, the moral integrity, and sometimes with the physical courage to break our complicit silence and start interrupting other men's abusive behavior. So I have a clip from him here.
How do we expect our sons to be men of integrity and of conscience and to be social justice advocates and to treat women with respect and to speak up when they see women being treated with disrespect if they don't see their fathers doing it, if they don't see men in the public culture doing it? It's not fair to put the burdens on the shoulders of boys or even young men, even though they're part of the solution, there's no question. This is about adult men.
So we can't just teach our kids and not be doing it ourselves, right? And this is, again, the difficulty when our politics come into contact with, our real lives. And so there's tips for feminist fathers out there that are really great that talk about, allowing kids to explore gender expression, teach your kids media literacy, empower your kids with tools to become advocates, talk to them about intersections, lovingly challenge them. This is a great shirt that was out for a while. I'm going to skip this. It's a very, very powerful ad. If you want to look it up, it's #DearDaddy. And what this woman is talking about is, do you want to watch it? Do you want me to just leave it? Okay. Sorry, I don't want to give you so much media.
Looking after me so well, even though I'm not yet born. I know you already try harder than Superman. You might even let Mommy eat sushi. But I need to ask you a favor. Warning. It's about boys. Because, you see, I will be born a girl, which means that by the time I'm 14, the boys in my class will have called me a whore, a bitch, a cunt, and many other things. It's just for fun, of course. Something boys do. So you won't worry. And I understand that. Perhaps you did the same when you were young, trying to impress some of the other boys. I'm sure you didn't mean anything by it. Still, some of the people won't get the joke. And funnily enough, it isn't any of the girls. It's some of the boys. So by the time I turn 16, a couple of the boys will have snuck their hands down my pants while I'm so drunk I can't even stand straight. And although I say no, they just laugh. It's funny, right? If you saw me, Daddy, you would be so ashamed, because I'm wasted. No wonder I'm raped when I'm 21. 21 and on my way home in a taxi driven by the son of a guy who went swimming with every Wednesday. The guy who always told insulting jokes, but they were of course only jokes, so you laughed. Had you known that his son would end up raping me, you would have told him to get grip. But how could you know? He was just a boy, telling weird jokes, and in any case it wasn't your business. You were just being nice. But his son, raised on these jokes, becomes my business. Then finally, I meet Mr. Perfect. And you're so happy for me, Daddy, because he really adores me. And he's smart, with a great job, and all through the winter he goes cross-country skiing 3 times a week, just like you. But one day he stops being Mr. Perfect. And I don't know why. Wait, am I overreacting? One thing I do know, I'm not the victim type. I'm raised to be a strong and independent woman. But one night it's just all too much for him, with work and the in-laws and the wedding coming up. So he calls me a whore, just like you called a girl in middle school a whore once. Then another day, he hits me. I mean, I'm way out of line. I can really be a bitch sometimes. But we're still the world's greatest couple, and I'm so confused because I love him and I hate him, and I'm not sure if I really did do something wrong. And then one day he almost kills me. It all goes black. Even though I have a PhD, a fantastic job, I'm loved by my friends and family, I'm well brought up, and nobody saw this coming. Dear Daddy, this is the favor I want to ask. One thing always leads to another. So please stop it before it gets the chance to begin. Don't let my brothers call girls whores, because they're not. And one day some little boy might think it's true. Don't accept insulting jokes from weird guys by the pool, or even friends, because behind every joke there is always some truth. Dear Daddy, I know you will protect me from lions, tigers, guns, cars, and even sushi without even thinking about the danger to your own life. But dear Daddy, I will be born a girl. Please do everything you can so that that won't stay the greatest danger of all.
Yeah, I'm glad I didn't skip that one. So I think that's powerful, right? Because it gets the idea again that, you know, rape culture isn't just this spottable stuff, seeing the guy in the alley, but it's all the little pieces. And this idea, not excusing boys will be boys, but boys will be held accountable for their actions just like girls are. There's a really powerful article about this woman. She's responding both to this culture and to this not all men idea. And she says, really importantly, the only people who believe that all men are violent men. And she says, this is why sexist jokes are so dangerous. They're not going to turn a man who abhors men's violence against women into a wife beater, but they can confirm a violent man's belief that all men do what he does. So she says it can be really difficult for people to understand the connection between sexist jokes and rape, murder, or violence against women. The vast majority of men who hear or even tell a sexist joke are never going to kill a woman, so the link is not immediately obvious. Not all men are violent, but violent men still think they are. So getting at what she talks about, right? This idea that certainly most of us know that, and so people will say it's just a joke, but for the one person in the room who does do this, that's confirming. So again, it's about calling out the grown-ups. Australia has some really amazing ads. I'm going to show you two brief ads that show, again, this sort of awkwardness. When are those moments where you can interject, and what do we do with them? So this is an ad campaign called Doing Nothing Does Harm, and it's got a series of them, so I'm just going to give you one, but there's a series of ads, and in the actual ads, you can go online, and when you'll see a countdown, you can actually click and see what you might do differently.
Hey, how can I help you?
You are gorgeous little thing.
How about some food?
Yeah, let's get some more garlic bread, some more water, and what time do you know?
So this idea that we have to call each other out, often people won't do it because it feels like this big, huge thing, and it might be this big, huge eruption, or who are you to do it? And what I really like about this other series of ads, these are unrelated, by the way. Australia is just really good at this. Respect Women, Call It Out. Again, they have 3 different versions, but this shows an interaction, and it shows what goes through the person's head as this thing is happening, and what it looks like to intervene.
A little bit like that. I think she's good cooking more. Love, this is barbecue. Boy, burning food, burning the shirts.
20 years, I say anything, just literally anything. That's all. What are you doing with it? Why are you annoying? Well, I know how it sounded. It wasn't good. Well, who lectures a friend? Oh, is that? No, she's going to embarrass herself. No, this is embarrassing. You need to say something.
It's terrible, right?
You know that's not okay.
So I don't know if you could all hear back there, but the stuff that goes on in his head. I'm not his dad. I shouldn't say anything. Who am I to say something? And he just says, that's embarrassing. I've just got to say, you've got to say something. And that's all he does is just say, you know, that's not right, right? I've got one more spoken word. This is really powerful. This man, Guante, does really beautiful work, but what he talks about here is what it looks like for men to not say something to other men. I'm going to close that door just in case it's not loud enough.
There was a conversation that never happened. Not even what we seemed more like storyboard, lost, an idea cut from the first draft. You, our co-star, slouched on the futon while we watched the game, telling me about your new girlfriend. Or more specifically, what you're going to do to your new girlfriend. Action. And part of me still remembers my lines, even though I never said them. The conversation, I just couldn't start for fear of embarrassment or losing our friendship, or just because the commercials were over. That one tiny gesture that might not have changed anything, but might have, I remember. I never muted the TV, never put my drink down, and never said, man, the way you talk about her, the way you treat her, your hands getting too big for your heart. I can smell the future you on your breath. She isn't safe. Now it's 2 weeks later, and we're standing in my kitchen. That same silence between us. She didn't want to press charges, so you're a convict with sledgehammer hands and no boulders to break them on. And I am remembering how we used to play football together. Numbers 55 and 56, both inside linebackers. I am remembering the dozens of conversations that never happened. The words oversleeping in the bed of my lungs. I am the least important person in this story, and part of me wants to believe that you wouldn't listen anyway. That some evil spirit whispered itself into your skull. Part of me wants to believe that we didn't grow up 3 blocks from each other, that our eyes aren't the same color. Part of me is always repeating those lines, always shooting that scene, always reminding myself that despite this guilt, I'm not a bad guy. You tell me. She never said no. That you're sorry. That you're not a bad guy. Rape culture, silence, is being able to see the future and not doing anything about it. It is believing the fairy tale platitude that there are good people and bad people, and that as long as you're not one of the bad people, your job is done. Your conscience is clear. It is all of us swimming through the same polluted waters of beer commercials, policing masculinity, and stand-up comedians making rape jokes to sound edgy, and media talking heads blaming the victim, and music portraying women as disposable sex objects. It is language encouraging us to think of sex as violence, fuck, hit, bang, smash. It is telling our daughters to dress sensibly and not walk alone at night, and telling our sons. It is a conversation that never happened. And this is not an excuse for you. It is a reminder for me that while her silence will always mean no, my silence, silence between us, will always mean yes.
I really like him. So, men who wish to be allies to women, there's great pieces out there, and I can send you a list of resources if you're interested. A lot of things people talk about, it's not women's job to educate you, so don't ask women to do additional emotional labor. Think about the space you take up, do your homework, seek out women's perspectives. Ask women to share stories with you. Think about the things you make, find other men doing this work, respect women's boundaries, don't police women's bodies or voices. So a lot of the same messages that we're seeing in a lot of these other clips. Doing this work doesn't make you a hero, but it sure does make you a better human being. Realize that doing this work is not a one-shot deal. Choose to create a culture that inherently values women and make this list obsolete. There are amazing resources out there. This is a great poster, ABCD Equality, from a domestic violence resource center. Walk like a woman. This gets at what you were talking about. So you stepped into the shoes of women. Now it's time to step up. And it's a beautiful website that actually breaks these steps down. So keep your distance, don't run up from behind, don't stare, keep comments to yourself, keep your friends in line, be an active bystander, share the walk. But it talks about very benign things that men can do to let women feel safe. So if you are having to share a space that's small, something as simple as being on your phone can create a little bit of distance so she knows you're not leering. Things of that sort. That's it. I went way longer in terms of the presentation piece. I meant to create a lot of space for dialogue, and hopefully we still can. I often like to just let other people say the things because I feel like they say them better. So hopefully there was a bit of a narrative there that will, maybe inspire some conversation. Yeah. So thanks for listening in this afternoon. It was exhausting. Does anyone want to start with?
Any questions or comments? Wonderful presentation. Thank you so
Mm.
much. Excellent. Any thoughts? It's a lot.
Yeah.
Reflecting.
Yeah.
Emotions going up and down.
Yeah, it's throwing a lot at you.
I mean, having little kids and then all these messages that.
Is that the first time you thought about it?
No, but I'm thinking like when I was a kid and then you see the Popeye, that is the Olivia, and then.
Yeah.
Like he has to rescue her always because she's weak, he's strong, and it's always through violence, right? It's never in a peaceful way or anything.
Really, hey?
Well, Popeye.
Oh, Popeye, yes. Okay, so Popeye and Olive.
Yes.
Olive oil.
In Spanish, it's Olivia. So.
Yes.
Anyone else?
I just want to share something real quick. I've been doing this work at night, like a designated driver, just helping a friend. And we drove a girl, she was like, I don't know, 18, not more than that. She told me, but I forgot. And she was telling me how a taxi or, Uber or whatever it was, took her, like us, like me, and I work with a lady, she's a little bit older. And I'm the one like driving the client in their car to their houses, right? Or homes. So I was driving her, and she was sharing with me at the end. She was like, "I'm so happy that you brought me home because I had this experience." And she told me like this guy like hitting on her just because it's like 3 a.m. and you're supposed to be man or woman, right? But we're talking about this. It was a man. And like, how can he think that she wanted something else? And it was an older guy to start with. And I shared with her the same kind of experience because it happened to me in Vallarta. Mm-hmm. And I was like 17 and I was so scared. I was working for a couple. He was from Venezuela, she was from the States. And it was my very first job because I wasn't old enough to work in Mexico. So it was like, I was taking care of this lady that had Alzheimer. Anyway, the point is that it was late and I was going to college in the morning. So I took this taxi and yeah, he pretty much like put his hand and I was like so scared. And I just like, didn't know what to do. So I shared with her because I wish that somebody would have told me what to do in that moment because I probably went like this or something, but not because I liked it, because I didn't know what to do and I was young. Yeah. You don't know what to do at that age. So, it kept me thinking like, it's still happening. I'm 39, just turned 39. And she's like 18 and the exact same thing happened to me. When was it? And it's still happening. This is here in Calgary. Like 2 weeks ago, she shared that with me. And this happened in Mexico to me. That was like, a long time, like 20 years ago. Don't make numbers. Anyway, it's sad, it's still happening. So I'm very happy that we're here today.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Just to follow up, this education is so important for boys, for guys to hear about this. I totally can relate. Right? I didn't have that experience here in Canada, but back at home in Ukraine, I was searching for a job and I was harassed at a job interview by a guy, an older man who was, saying, "Oh, your hands look nice. They would look better in the jewelries And then, came up to me and said, like, how tall are you? Oh, you're tall enough. And I remember that freezing, like, fear and, like, paralyzed. I didn't know what to do. I looked at the door. The door was open, thanks God. And I was just like, ha, ha, ha. And I just quickly left. And I was happy that, like, I, didn't get in trouble with this guy. I get out, and I was, like, laughing and crying at the same time. But it's those little, not little, but other little things that just stay with you and they kind of disempower you. So I go to street self-defense classes for over a year now, and I assisted in a couple of classes for women, and we have women who survived sexual assault and harassment or domestic violence. So, and it's interesting to see how, like, guys, when at the training, they can, when they do the hits, they are not afraid to actually, like, make sounds. And women are so socialized not to, express, first of all, their aggression, not to actually feel it. And we're so, like, we are even afraid to yell when we, make sound when we try to hit, and we, like, do it so carefully. And, in those situations, we just freeze. Like, we don't know what to do. We don't want to, get worse. And it's, like, so in the brain, like in subconscious somewhere.
We talk about that a lot right now, that in the trauma response, that we always hear fight or flight, but freeze is a major one that's not talked about. Freeze is one of the most dominant responses to fear, and then we think we're doing something wrong, but that's a natural response. So and then you compound that with socialization, and thank you for sharing.
So one last thing, can you see how, like, we're all from different backgrounds, different countries, and how can it's a worldwide thing. It's just wow, and that helps me also to see that we really are one. Doesn't matter, where we're coming from. We're the same thing, and it's the same issue that we need to heal as one. So good for all of us.
So, coming from a perspective of a man, because you talk about the role of media in creating a rape culture. So I think it's also a challenge as a community leader, and also maybe with some millennial here, that they rely so much on social media, and that's the problem with millennials nowadays, because they don't know how to filter, how to gauge which one is real and which one is not. I think one of our challenges is how we can counter that rape culture that is being all over social media. It's becoming an alarming, like, I could see from the starting point that my kid is watching, even that Lego. Like, I was shocked, and with other kids' movie, like.
I think one of the starting points, because often people will say this, and when I started to do this work, I still loved all the media that was really problematic. And so that was really challenging. And I had students that will often come up and say, I hear you and I agree with you, but I really like this stuff. And when I had interviewed professionals who worked in sexual violence, and they said the same thing. One woman, it was really interesting. She said, I really like some of this stuff. So she said, I draw the line, I won't pay for the music. But if somebody sends it to me, it's still okay. So I always say the first step is, I think, to be just aware, right? Because otherwise there's nothing to watch. So how do you be critically aware? You have conversations with your children about it. Because my little guy, same thing. It's everywhere. And there is more or less, there are things on social media. There's a really great campaign called #UseTheRightWords. And so what they'll do is they'll respond to problematic headlines. So, right now, Brock Turner, the man who assaulted the woman at Stanford, she was passed out behind him. So right now he's in the media again because she's releasing a book, really powerful book called Know My Name. And so they keep referring to him as the Stanford swimmer. And so people are erasing that and then putting hashtag use the right words, rapist Brock Turner. So there are small ways in which you can speak back. There's a lot of people who correct headlines when it says, police officer had sex with 14-year-old child, and it's like police officer raped child. And they'll correct it. So there's some more or less explicit ways, but even with the other pieces, right? It's about being critical and at least inviting that conversation, because certainly we can't just necessarily shut it all off. So how do we do a first step? And sometimes that's the big piece. And I think it was suggested in there is just having those media conversations with your children and, what are we seeing and what does that look like? Because, my little guy is getting exposed to this too, and indirectly and directly. And so it's hard. It's a lot of work.
Because one of the ads that really struck in my head is the Dear Daddy one.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Wrestling.
Yeah. Dear Daddy.
The ad is not talking about the future men. They're talking about us parents of how we're going to raise our kids.
Yeah.
Very I had that moment and said, oh boy.
Yeah.
I have a big task in my shoulder. How could I as a parent, make my son to make a difference?
Like when,
You had your hand.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was raised up with my parents, my dad. There were lots of comments that were sexist, racist, jokes that were sexist, very racist, terrible when you think about it. At the time it was considered normal. It was just the norm, It's not until we started talking about it that things started to change, and then everybody changed and started looking at that as being unacceptable. When I'm looking at the movies, that doesn't make the entire movie bad. It's just small sections. It's just if we start pointing that out like you're doing, like we're doing right now, it's just start like that. With time, it's going to change. And maybe that's the point. It's not to stop watching the movies, but when we see that, talk about it and recognize it. And maybe that's the first step.
Like seeing things from a critical point of view, not copying models, but separating from that model and saying, okay, that's a model that's funny, but I will not copy it. It's just there to be criticized.
It's like when you watch, you read you may know Tintin. Yeah, it's very popular in French side, but when you read these books, it's extremely racist.
Right.
But that doesn't make the whole Tintin bad. It's just you have to put it in the context of the time. But you still need to recognize and talk about what's racist into it. And I think right now we're probably in a culture where we're starting to realize, we're starting to talk about sexual abuse. And we have to continue talking about what we're doing right now, so we can change in the future.
Yeah.
I don't know if I made myself very clear.
I think
the
so.
difference between what is considered normal in a certain time, in a certain cultural context.
I think that's what you're saying, right? It's create a new normal. A new normal that's absent those things.
Yeah. But that doesn't mean you need to throw everything that's bad from the 60s.
Right, it's what can we learn from it and evolve and change.
And it's the same thing with our culture.
I just wanted to say, it's like collective consciousness, right? Like before, a very delicate topic, slavery. People back then thought, oh, it's okay. You're darker color, you're nobody. And white color is wow, no? And then one day somebody said, hey, that's totally wrong. Like this. We're waking up. It's like, right? It's like after there's like lots of damage in people, and we see like the stories that we just shared, like that's definitely not right. Doesn't make any sense, right? And after the hurt that caused, then we see, oh, okay, that's not working. And we're, like I said, I think like waking up, and that's what collective consciousness is. The more we agree on something, the more we all wake up, and then we do things different, and it's better for everybody.
And it's hearing and knowing differently, right? Because I think one of the best things that in terms of my experience, at learning is that you can't unsee it. Now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it. So now you're going to look at Disney a little bit differently. And, it doesn't mean we just turn it off necessarily, but okay, so what's a talking point in there that I might have with my son or daughter? Like, I know my little guy was really proud one day when he said to me, because I try in my house to not make everything about boys. And so he said to me at one point, his two best friends are William and Kaylee, a little boy and a little girl. And I said, do you guys want to have a play date? And he looked at me and he said, Mom, we're not all guys. And I was like, oh, you've been listening. And I screwed up. And so he said, we're not all guys. And I thought that was a really big moment, right? So, he's 6, but he's going to correct his friends when they say you guys and they mean everybody, because we're not all guys, and those little things.
Yeah, and it's like I see it as a room in darkness, where, you turn on your little light and you do the same, and you do the same. And then one day, our big hope for everybody, will be like that we all turn up, these little lights, and then the room will be light up.
Yeah. It's a beautiful picture.
I think we're gonna go in for a break. I just wanted to say though, is that the presentations such as this, the things that we've been talking about today, they can bring up lots of stuff. For some of us, I know I had a part where I had something slipped out of the room. For myself, stuff that might be familiar, stuff we might have experienced, stuff that reminds us of our own or somebody else who we love or care about has experienced. And so it's really important to take care of ourselves while we're learning. And so I want to thank Kiara, and Anna's going to do a bit of a thank you before we go to break, because I know Kiara's got to go, but Lemlem and I are here and we're available if anyone would like to talk during the break a little bit more. It's totally okay to reach out, so just wanted to put that out there.
I meant to bring a handful of resources and I forgot, but CASA, Calgary Communities Against Sexual Abuse, is amazing. They have a great crisis line. The Distress Center always talks about all the time. They said the misnomer about us is that you have to call when you're in distress. We want you to call before you're feeling distressed. So there's lots of great resources too outside of this space. Yeah.